Okay, sorry, Dr. Nolan. We have having a little bit problem just now. So now we are live. Okay, so
Okay.
before we start, Assalamualaikum and everyone. Assalamualaikum and very good day, everyone. So on behalf of University Malaysia Pahang and the Celik Digital Alliance UMP STEM Lab Organizing Committee, I am honored to welcome you to the Celik Digital Symposium on Media and Information Literacy across nation. My name is Yasmin Abdul Wahab from UMP and I will be moderating the session today. Our symposium is a 3-day program targeting school teachers and the education committee. The symposium will be held online from October 3rd until 5th, this is the last sessions of our symposium today, and a workshop in University Malaysia Pahang on October 12th to 2022. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. The symposium is conceptualized as an engagement platform exclusively not only for UMP staff and students, but the community in general. The symposium features professionals and industry experts to share their knowledge, technologies, and innovative approaches in their respective area, as well as best practice in the application and the use of these technologies. On the left-hand side, of the poster is a QR code and a link to the attendance registration. Every participant will get an e-certificate upon completion of this event. Please register before end of the session today. Okay. Besides, we are very pleased with our collaboration with UNESCO in organizing this symposium. The symposium is an initiative under Celik Digital Alliance UMP STEM Lab, which is a collaborative effort between UMP and UNESCO Information for All program, or the short name is IFAP. The symposium aims to raise awareness, discuss, and deliberate about digital competency for information literacy and its implementation strategies across different nations. Okay, so this is some what we call that one as the attentions for the participant. Our professional talk series today is aired live via UMP STEM Lab YouTube channel, as well as on Divisions of Industry and Community Network Icon Facebook page. Please be patient if you experience any technical or any internet glitch during this webinar. If the station is disconnected abruptly at any point of time, please hang on tight as the show will go on and we will definitely be right back in a short while. You will have the opportunity to submit text question to today's presenter by typing your question into the comment section via YouTube or Facebook. You may send your question at any time during the presentation, and we will collect this question and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the today's presentation. If you'd like to contact us, please email us at stemlab@ump.edu.my. Okay, Dr. Nolan, how are you today?
Doing well. How are you?
Okay, fine. Okay, before we start, let me introduce you a little bit to our participant today. Okay?
Sure.
So before I invite our speaker today, let me introduce our speaker today. Dr. Nolan Higdon is an author and university lecturer at Mary College and the Education Department at University of California, Santa Cruz. Higdon's area of concentration include podcasting, digital culture, news media history, and critical media literacy. Higdon is a regular contributor to Savage Mind and a project censored national judge. He's the author of The Anatomy of Fake News, a critical news literacy education, University of California Press 2020. His most recent publication include Let's Agree to Disagree, A Critical Thinking Guide to Communication, Conflict Management and Critical Media Literacy, Routledge 2022, with Mickey Huff and the Podcaster's Dilemma. Dilemma: Decolonizing Podcaster in the Era of Surveillance Capitalism, which is really 2021, with Nicholas Tree. Hidden is a founding member of the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas. In addition, he has been a source of expertise for CBS, NBC, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Chronicles. Okay, all right. So without further ado, I think I would like to invite our speaker to give his speech. Okay, Dr. Nolan, so please welcome. Let me stop my presenter first, okay?
Okay. All right, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for hosting me and giving me the opportunity to present on the state of media literacy in the U.S. With a focus on some of the differences between critical and acritical media literacy. I'm going to bring my slideshow up here. There we go. Okay, cool. And so what I want to talk to you about is kind of in the United States, how we define media literacy more generally. And then I want to look at some of the different approaches to media literacy in the U.S. And then I want to make a case for the need for critical media literacy in the United States. So I'll start with the state of media literacy in the U.S. And the U.S. broadly defines media literacy as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create and act using all forms of communication. And that's a definition the U.S. has largely used since the early 1990s. Although there's a lot of talk about media literacy inside the United States, there's a real dearth of offerings. We don't offer many media literacy courses. This is partly because I'm sure this is true elsewhere, but in the U.S., a lot of people have yet to kind of believe like the value in media. There's like this elitism that believes like, the students should just be reading books and articles. And there's kind of this elitism about bringing like film or music in the classroom. The U.S. also has a really unique decentralized education system. So local school boards have a lot of power of determining what goes in the classroom. And so to get media literacy offered takes a lot of work at the local level. And we just haven't seen that going on enough. After the 2016 sort of what I call like moral panic over fake news, we saw a lot more states try and pass legislation to incentivize media literacy, but most of it is pretty toothless. It's not really strong. There's not really resources behind it. There's not mandates behind it. So even though there's a lot of rhetoric toward media literacy in the last 5 or so years in the US, there's still very few offerings. Because we don't have a central organizing media system, we have a lot of organizations that work to get media literacy into US schools or to get in the hands of parents and others. And so I have some of those on the screen here, and they range from critical and acritical. A lot of these folks do different work in the United States and trying to get media literacy in the classroom. So now I want to talk to you about the different approaches to media literacy in the US. And I think that will help kind of contextualize how we get to this moment of critical versus acritical in the United States before we jump into that. So in the United States, we have sort of 4 approaches to media literacy. We have what's known as the protectionist approach, the media arts approach, the media literacy movement, and the critical media literacy approach. And we'll go through each of these one by one, these 4 approaches. The protectionist approach was kind of the earliest approach to media literacy. This is a lot of the 20th century, focused on basically this fear of media, so whether it be comic books or radio or now the internet, there's this fear that media is destroying our children. So a protectionist approach tries to teach students how to avoid media, to limit media, to spend less time with media, because the fear is that media are going to manipulate or addict audiences, at least from a protectionist viewpoint. A protectionist approach really values this like old days, so believes we had better, more productive media use in the past than we have now, for example. The criticisms of the protectionist approach are that it has a real anti-media bias, so it doesn't look at the positives or opportunities with media. It's criticized for oversimplifying our complex relationship with media. Media does not, protectionists don't account for the fact that we can talk back to media or that we can negotiate our relationship with media. As a result, it removes the potential to talk about how media can improve or empower people's lives. So the second approach to media literacy education in the US is the media arts approach. And this approach values like the aesthetic qualities of media, so it teaches students to appreciate the beauty of media. It encourages creativity and self-expression, which the protectionist approach did not do. In U.S. schools, there's a lot of media arts education. It's usually, though, in standalone classes or outside of the classroom, like community-based programs. It has experimental learning, hands-on, creative, and it values students' pleasure in the production process of media. The criticism of this is that it's often too technical, just about like how to produce media versus interrogate media. So that's to say it's largely been an acritical approach. We'll talk a little more about what that means in a moment. The third approach is the media literacy movement. And this is aimed at expanding users' understanding of how we communicate with printed words. Education can and should be politically neutral in the eyes of the media literacy movement. They focus on semiotics and intertextuality, and they really center the classroom around ideas of student engagement and student participation. So that's kind of media literacy movement has moved us a long way from where the protectionist approach was, and certainly aspects of the arts education. The criticisms, though, of the media literacy movement is that it does not engage with the political dimensions of education and literacy. It exposes students to media content without teaching them how to question the power dynamics behind that media. And as a result, it waters down the transformative potential of media. If we don't talk about power dynamics and we don't contextualize media, critics argue, you temper down the possibilities for transformation. So in response to the limited approaches to media literacy, the critical media literacy approach was created as a response, and it was going to use critical theory from the Frankfurt School and Birmingham School to analyze media. So it teaches students to think critically about media, enhance democracy and civic participation by looking at media and creating media, use media for social communication and change, introduce ideology and encourage students to interrogate ideologies, as well as messages and politics of representation. And it asks students to look at media in the social context in which it emerges. So looking at issues of control, resistance, pleasure, and promoting alternative media production. The critiques, and this is a pretty substantive definition here. It looks like it got a little too big for the slide. That came out of the Critical Media Literacy Conference in 2021. About 30 critical media scholars put this definition together. The critiques of the critical media approach are that it's too political and too dogmatic, according to acritical scholars. Those who do not want a critical approach, we call acritical scholars. Acritical scholars believe that a critical approach has too much theory and not enough data. And some say that by teaching about inequities and ideology and power, the critical approach is authoritarian. So that's one of the critiques of the critical approach as well. But again, to think critically about media really means to investigate power and privilege. So it's not telling people, when done well, it's not telling people what to think, but how to think. It investigates the production process. It looks at messaging. It looks at ideology, looks at representation, and looks at audience as a big part of that. And I wanted to just kind of share this with you all. This comes from Jeff Scherer and Douglas Kellner from UCLA. And it lays out the ways in which conceptual understandings and the critical media approach can guide the questions that students should ask about media as well. And I'm happy to share this content with the conference organizers as well to pass along to all of you as well. Symposium organizers, excuse me, misspoke. So with that, I think that gives us kind of some scaffolding to talk about this acritical and critical divide in the United States, which this divide has really been around for about 30 or 40 years. From some of the early definitions and applications of media literacy, the U.S. has had unresolved conflicts about how we offer media literacy and whether or not to offer a critical approach, which has the critical theory and those critical questions we just talked about, or if it shouldn't, has always been an argument in the U.S. And that argument persists today. And I think I notice the emphasis on digital for a lot of the content for this symposium. Clearly, the digital age has reemerged a lot of those questions in often uncomfortable ways. And that's something I want to talk about tonight as well. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you in the Q&A part as well about this. So one of the major issues that shaped this divide between critical and acritical approaches to media literacy was, what was the role of corporate media going to be in this educational process? And this comes from the fact that there are a lot of corporations, media corporations, who claim that they want to spread media literacy around the US, but they want to spread a real acritical media literacy. That is, they want to teach students how to use the tools, they want to normalize the tools, they want to celebrate the tools. They don't want students critically analyzing the companies behind the tools. And so there's been this fight about whether or not corporate money should shape the content or the teacher training inside the US. The acritical scholars think that the corporate funding is not a problem. They argue that corporate media have spent so much money on creating corporate content that they have an obligation to also fund corporate media literacy education. Critical scholars believe, no, with money comes power, and that power will shape the education to be on the side of corporations, not on this free or objective learning exercise. And well into the 21st century, this fight continued between critical and acritical scholars. You had folks like Jolly and Earp arguing that corporate inclusion in media literacy would harm the field. Meanwhile, Hobbes and others defended the use of corporate media. One of the paramount events in this fight was a fight over something called Channel One News. And so essentially what Channel One News was that it was offered to schools as a way to have a morning news program that could inform students. But in between the news program, there'd be advertisements. So this was a way to get advertisements into the classroom under the auspices of providing news and information. This really divided the field in big ways in the United States. You had the big media literacy group, NAMLY, which is the National Association of Media Literacy Education in the US. They were defending this decision, and they would continue to this day to take corporate funding. Meanwhile, acritical groups like the Action Coalition for Media Education, ACME, or Project Censored, they refuse corporate funding, and they would create an alternative critical media literacy movement. And so this is where this division comes from in the US. Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago, these divides became much more stark in the digital age, because just like pre-digital corporate media, tech companies today, such as Alphabet, which owns Google and YouTube, or Meta, which owns Facebook, or is Facebook now, Twitter, and others, they recognize that this demand for media literacy education was an opportunity to use their economic power and influence to reshape the classroom. And I highly encourage folks to go back and look at the work of Zoe Druick, who I have on the screen there from 2016. Druick outlined this kind of like pre-digital efforts by corporate media to get in the classroom. And, since then, Allison Butler and myself have built upon that. But essentially, since the fake news panic in 2016, and definitely during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a lot more inclusion of big tech in the classroom. A lot of it under the auspices of offering media literacy. And for those who are sort of not critically literate, right, they will think that these tools are free, when in fact they're not free, right? Big tech makes its money by collecting and analyzing data, and selling that analysis and or sharing that data with third partners. These could be governments, these could be corporations, these could be data brokers. It just depends. So in that sense, because here in the US we have compulsory public education, if you can get into public schools, there's a lot of money to be made monitoring data and collecting. So this furthers that divide between the critical and acritical scholars. Now, I want to give you also an idea of who some of these acritical organizations are as well. So groups like this, the Center for Media Literacy, they advocate for corporate inclusion in the education process. Most recently, they just released an article funded by NATO. NAMLY has many corporate partners like Meta, Facebook, Nickelodeon, you name it. NewsGuard, which is a browser extension used here in the US, they take funds from corporations and military industrial complex and others as well. So these are groups that really don't think that those relationships will shape the education process. But critical scholars, of course, disagree. They think that by allowing corporations and government entities in the classroom, you're reinforcing existing power relations. So a critical approach would teach students to interrogate that. So we can bring NewsGuard into the classroom, but we're going to look at who's on NewsGuard's board. We're going to look at how their conflicts of interest might shape the browser extension itself. Where an acritical approach would trust NewsGuard and trust its rating system. To this day, studies have found, including my research with Dr. Butler, that digital media literacy content from big tech continues to serve the interests of big tech in the classroom. So it's a very walled off education. A lot of it's predicated on, neoliberal ideology. And the only transformation that happens in the classroom with big tech, unless you have a critical perspective, is that it really just transforms the classroom into a data collecting operation for those scholars. Critical scholars contend that such practices are reminiscent of like big tobacco's appeal to children at a young age to get them hooked. That big tech tries to do the same, tries to get folks hooked at a young age. And so I like this analogy because just think about if you were teaching in the US in the 1950s, would you teach students to comment on and appreciate like a tobacco ad, or would you rather have a critical perspective where you interrogate the power dynamics of the ad and what it's trying to sell you, et cetera? I also think it's worth noting here in the U.S., and I apologize, I'm ignorant of how much of a global attention these stories have received. But we did have a whistleblower from Meta who made a lot of news here in the U.S. last year. And among the many revelations from that whistleblower was that the company, had a goal of getting young people hooked on their tools. And even when they had internal studies about how young people's mental health was connected to the usage of Meta platforms, Meta would choose profit over people. And this is their own internal documentation, not me as the outsider saying this. And I think it raises serious questions for the people in the acritical movement who for years have defended the inclusion of these corporations in the media literacy process, because I think it speaks to how their real desire is to collect data and collect customers, not educate young people on media literacy. There's also, strong evidence. It also is strong evidence, that is the whistleblower revelations are strong evidence why we need a more critical approach. I think educators should still bring Meta into the classroom. These social media platforms are being used by students. It would be almost laughable if we didn't reference them in the classroom. But a critical approach is a much more responsible way to do it. Ask, what are these platforms trying to achieve? Is it really free? If you're toiling away with labor, if you're giving up privacy, those kinds of things. And I think since the COVID-19 pandemic, where we've seen, due to lockdowns and things like that, such a normalization of using these tools and having unquestioned surveillance, now's a really good time to get students to start asking these questions as we see more and more use of these in the classroom. In addition to looking at the companies behind the tools in the digital age, it's also important for educators to think about how to look at the ideologies that are expressed by these tools outside of the classroom. There's been some great work by, Safiya Noble, for example, has shown how search engines will reinforce the ideological bias of their creators. And so much of Silicon Valley is white men, and a lot of the search engines reinforce racist and sexist attitudes. And she has some really convincing data of that in her work. There's also been a ton of work, though, about how these digital tools exacerbate racial, class, and gender inequities. Virginia Eubanks has done some great work on automating inequality, which talks about how, a lot of government assistance programs use these algorithms as a way to disqualify people from accessing government assistance. So talking to students about that, about how these algorithms are not objective, they reflect a lot of the biases of their creators. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there that acritical folks seem unwilling to do. And I think lastly, something that's really important to think about as well is in the United States right now, we're having a lot of discussions about how voices are being censored or so-called canceled in American media. And a lot of the critiques are coming from conservatives. And there's a substantial amount of liberals who are fighting to get some conservative voices off social media because they're white supremacists or et cetera. And regardless of how you feel about that, I think it's a rich opportunity for critical scholars to ask questions about power. Do you want power? Do you want big tech to be determining what you should and shouldn't access? I think we should also point out the fact that it's not only conservative voices, but also progressive and liberal voices are getting censored in the United States as well. A moment ago, I talked to you about Safiya Noble. She was the keynote speaker at the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas, which I host in 2020. And, she's very progressive voice, and her research has very progressive implications. And yet YouTube removed her presentation from its platform. So a woman presenting on algorithms of oppression was removed by an algorithm. The jokes write themselves. But I think broadening that scope beyond the media narratives of just conservatives and bringing in issues of power and looking at progressives is a much more robust approach where acritical folks want to avoid those topics altogether. They think we should try and depoliticize the classroom by not looking at these larger issues with media. So there's a lot more I can say about the nuts and bolts of critical versus acritical, and I'm happy to get in that. What I didn't really talk about, and we can in the Q&A, of course, not every moment of a critical classroom is critical. Like sometimes you can teach someone how to take a picture, for example, or you can teach someone how to make a poster, and that's not necessarily critical. So there's a lot of overlap too, which if folks are interested in that, we can get in that in the Q&A. But I think we have enough scaffolding here to have a nice conversation for the last 15 or 20 minutes. And I really appreciate you all tuning in and listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nolan. We have a few questions actually from our audience today. Maybe I can read the first question from Suliana Abugani. Okay. She asks, how to deal with the pleasure that students get from watching television and other forms of media?
That's a great question. Thank you very much for asking it. I think one thing we shouldn't deny or dismiss the pleasure as an educator. And I think all educators, whether you're critical or acritical, I think we should and do usually respect the pleasure. Like students are using these tools and they are getting some joy out of it. But I think, we also have an obligation to talk to them about perhaps other feelings they get from these tools as well. Like, is everything really joy? I think we have a responsibility, especially as adults and educators, to talk about issues of like cyberbullying or mental health or just divisiveness. We know these platforms are built to divide, or is this crippling friendships or crippling relationships? So I think that we can talk about pleasure, and we can also talk about problems. And a critical approach wouldn't tell students to use or not use these platforms. It would empower them to say, like, hey, compare the benefits that you think you derive from using them to any potential problems that come with using these platforms. Maybe as simple as like making a side-by-side list, and then decide, are the benefits worth the dangers? Ultimately, you are empowered as the user to use it. I think treating students that way is a much more empowering exercise than telling them, you don't get joy from it or you shouldn't use it, things like that.
Yeah, I also agree with you. The problem is also one of the approach, right, compared to the pleasure itself, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. Can I read a second question from the participant? From Nurul Fazila Hassan. In your opinion, is metaverse a good thing?
Is metaverse a good thing?
Yeah, the question is metaverse a good thing? She asked you that question.
Thank you very much. Great question. I think all media can be a good or a bad thing. It depends on what we do with it. The internet, you couldn't, think of a world where if the internet was invented and nobody ever used it, it would be harmless to have it on Earth, right? But we chose to use it. And we also let it be designed in a certain way, right? In the United States, we had certain laws we did and didn't create that made the internet look the way it is. Those laws, our economic system, have incentivized social media to become something very narrow. It's something that collects, analyzes data. It tries to keep users addicted to their screens. And so the metaverse is probably going to follow in that trajectory. So in that sense, I think it's a bad use of media because I think it's going to have a bad ultimate effect on people. But I do like to think in a positive way about what would a more like inclusive social media look like a social media that was actually social, or one that didn't try and exploit us or divide us, but tried to empower us and connect us. So I still have faith that we could create this, but the current media landscape we've allowed to be developed, I don't think is there. And I'm afraid metaverse is going to be an extension of those problems.
Okay. Right. The third question from Fatin Amira. Let me read the question. Okay. Social media critically responsible for aggravating mental health problems in this era. So how to improve the critical scholar to be as loud as acritical, thoughts to give impact to spread awareness.
I love this question. It's getting to solutions, which I'm a big fan of. So I just love this question. Thank you so much for asking
Okay.
it. Yeah, I think if you have a critical approach in your education and you're a teacher or an educator, excuse me, you're always going to be at a disadvantage because a critical approach is trying to challenge power structures. So you're always going to be challenging those in power. So in some way, we're always going to be kind of fighting back. But I think the fight or the resistance necessitates collectivism. So we have to unite together. We have to be supportive of one another. I think moments like this where we use this tech to connect across the globe, to have these kinds of discussions, I think those are really important in that sense. And so I think more connections, more resistance. I think also using the networks we have. Not everybody needs to be a formal educator in a classroom to spread this information. We can write opinion editorials. We can have community groups. We can talk to parent groups. We can make resources free to people, both online or in person. And I know organizations in the United States have done this for quite some time. And I know other places have around the world. I'm just more familiar with the US. So I just think it takes that constant effort to reach people where they're at and do the hard work. But I'm optimistic. I think since the 1990s, and a lot of the world has kind of had this positivist or utopian approach to tech. And I've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, people have started to realize some of the problems with this industry. And so I think there's a nice window in there where we can make this critical approach more popular than it's been previously.
Okay, I think it's a good question. All right, we have another 2 questions from the audience. From teacher Lina, she asks, how can practitioners of both acritical and critical media literacy build on what they have in common to encourage people to think critically about media?
I think, I think going back to the previous question, I think we all need to work together to just amplify media literacy in general and to normalize it being in schools. So the generation that are students today will become the teachers of tomorrow, and they'll expect to have critical media literacy in their classroom. The debates about acritical and critical, scholars and organizations can have those, but I think we all agree that media literacy is needed in the US. So as long as we keep that simple message and unite around it, I think we'll make some serious progress if we keep that message both domestically and globally.
Okay, right. I also agree with you that one because of everyone should be spread that awareness, right? It's just not it's from the parents, from the children, and also to the community, right? Maybe this is last question, Dr. Nolan, from Rohana Abdul Karim. What kinds of resources and assistance are necessary for educators to successfully integrate media literacy into their classroom?
Good. I'll start by answering the opposite question, which is one of the mistakes we make is we try and add media literacy in addition to everything we're already doing. And look, there's a bunch of educators listening right now, and I know you all will agree with what I'm about to say, which is it feels like every day, every minute, educators are getting more and more responsibility thrown on them. And so to some educators, media literacy can sound like, oh my goodness, another thing I have to do that I already don't have time for. So I think a mistake is to try and add media literacy as in addition to other things. I think you can use it in place of things. So think about, the learning outcomes or the goals of lessons that you're trying to teach, and find a media literacy program that will achieve that same lesson. So maybe students don't have to write an essay, for example. Maybe they can create a podcast, or maybe they're not finding fallacies in like an article. Maybe they're finding fallacies in like a news media segment. There's a lot of these ways in which you can replace, shall we say, more traditional lessons with a media literacy lesson and get the same learning outcomes. Of course, educators are professionals, and every educator can probably do this work on their own. But it does help to reach out to organizations that are known for helping teachers in this way. So like in the United States, Mass Media Literacy does a lot of that work. Project Censored does a lot of that work for free. Acme does a lot of that work for free. The Critical Media Project does a lot of that work for, when I say free, I mean actual free. They give you free resources. They will consult with teachers. So using that, at UCLA, there's a free online resource called the Education Library Guide. It's Education Library Guide it's either 166 or 466. And Jeff Scher from UCLA, was a towering figure in the field. He created the library guide, and there's a litany of resources for educators. And if you go in there thinking about like, hey, I want to replace this assignment with media literacy, I promise you there's something you'll find in there. And that's UCLA's Education, either 466 or 166 library guide on critical media literacy. So those organizations and resources are out there. I think thinking about it in that way can be a little more productive. And I've done a lot of this work with mass media literacy and Project Censored over the years, and teachers are usually pretty receptive. They say that that's a much better approach, where in the past people have tried to throw more stuff on their plate and it hasn't worked out so well.
Right, very good sharing about the resources that we can refer to, Dr. Nolan. Maybe I have last question from me. Instead of educator itself, we as parents, right, when we have a very small children, what is a good approach for us as a parents to give the awareness among very small children, like 2 or 1 to 2 years old, instead of we have the students at the kindergartens or the pupils at the secondary schools? What is a good approach from your opinions that we as a parents can share to a very small children's about the media literacy?
I think there's so there's so many, but to speak broadly, one I think I would really champion is I think media making in the classroom is really important. Mm-hmm. I think when we make media, we learn more about the production process. And you start to demystify media. So, if you make for example, a movie in the classroom or a podcast in the classroom, you're not going to make a Hollywood production, but students will learn in the process, like, oh, this stuff is created, these decisions were made, and you kind of plant that seed that you can then build upon in subsequent years. I also think that the same is true with advertising. Getting students to recognize, like, what is this advertisement trying to do? Like, what is it trying to sell you? And encouraging them to make advertisements, make their own advertising. How would they sell themselves, or how would they sell, a product they made in the classroom? So getting that production process, I think, is like invaluable for students, because when we learn how to make media, we become more responsible media users.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. I think we are at the end of this session. Thank you very much again, Dr. Nolan, for a very good sharing for us today. So, and also thank you for everyone, for all the participants. So, see you next time. Thank you again, Dr. Nolan, and everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.